Laut China Selatan telah muncul menjadi titik krisis global. Kekuatan militer Amerika Serikat dan China kerap bersitegang atas laut seluas 3,5 juta kilometer persegi yang seluruh atau sebagiannya diklaim oleh 6 negara. Jadi, apa yang dipertaruhkan di Laut China Selatan?
It is arguably the busiest trading route on the planet, given that so much from the Middle East and Europe transits there to get to China, Japan, and the US. But nobody has a stake in messing with that trade, neither the US or China. That's a bit of a red herring. It also has mineral wealth, but not nearly as much as people talk about. It's not another Persian Gulf. The oil and gas is really only of value to the closest state, so China can't even get most of this stuff that it objects to other people getting.
So China's claim is based on this very vague night dash line surrounding the South China Sea, but as of now, the Chinese government has not given the exact coordinates of all of these night dash lines. My understanding is that China does not want to publicize them in order to achieve strategic ambiguity, i.e. if the target countries, Vietnam, Malaysia, the Philippines, for example, do not know where the locations of these coordinates are, they're less likely to try to trigger a Chinese response.
China claims this based on a historic fallacy. You had a single Chinese cartographer in the early 1930s, basically, who drew this line on a map, basically on British sailing charts, and said everything in the line is China's. And here we are almost a century later dealing with that mistake.
So China currently occupies 8 or 9 land features in the South China Sea, and there has been a plan to reclaim, expand on those land features since around 2012. I mean, it doesn't mean that other South China Sea claimants didn't do that, but it's just that the scale of Chinese land reclamation is so large that it dwarfs all of the land reclaiming activities of the rest of the claimants in the South China Sea. And China has been putting, for example, runways or military facilities on these land features.
Over the last several years, it's really been focused on intimidation and bullying. What China wants to do is convince its neighbors, the smaller Southeast Asian claimants, that the fight's not worth having, that China's victory is inevitable, China will have de facto control of all these waters and airspace, international law be damned, and that the United States in particular is a paper tiger. The Americans might sail through the South China Sea and make some noise, but at the end of the day, the U.S. doesn't have the staying power, doesn't have the wherewithal to do anything about this. And so Southeast Asian claimants should just accept whatever deals China's offering. The way it does that is basically by sending its Coast Guard ships and its fishing militia, these are notionally civilian but really armed to the state out there, to play chicken with people, to make it dangerous to operate.
The Coast Guard ships, they use water cannons or even just a direct clash or collision because the Chinese Coast Guard ships, they're larger than their Philippine or Vietnamese counterparts. So if a collision takes place, it's more likely to cause damage to the Philippine or Vietnamese vessels.
To date, China has not used overt force against its smaller neighbors, but none of that is going to stop this creeping policy of intimidation and bullying. So even though nobody who's not a claimant cares about these rocks and reefs particularly, we don't care if they're Filipino or Malaysian or Chinese, we do care how they get resolved. The idea that China gets to use force if it wants to resolve this is a problem. It's especially a problem because one of the claimants, the Philippines, is a U.S. treaty ally. And, the U.S. doesn't want to fight over strategically insignificant rocks, but it also can't afford to be seen to abandon an ally if China does use force, which puts Washington in a bind.
We think those disputes ought to be handled peaceably. We don't think they should be handled through intimidation or through maritime militias or by ramming ships or by surrounding islands. And that's just not how things should be done in the 21st century. Those are things that, that's like, that's conquest.
But I do think that these kind of protests are fairly common. Back in 2014, there were a lot of intense protests against China And I think even some of them went a little bit more violent in terms of, for example, setting fire or damaging Chinese-owned factories in Vietnam. Vietnam certainly cares a lot about the South China Sea. I would say much more so than China does, because its livelihood actually depends on the South China Sea. For the economic benefits, for example, oil and gas and fishing.
When you really drill down to it, what this is about is nationalism. You have a set of countries who have told themselves a story that this is mine and it always has been. People have been fighting over strategically insignificant specks of land for as long as there have been people. Just because it's on a boat doesn't make it any more rational in the South China Sea.